Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It is 9:30, so this Newham local plan examination hearing session is open. I'm William Fieldhouse, the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the Newham local plan. Can everyone hear me okay? Back row. Yeah. So we haven't got microphones in this room, so if everyone may speak, they can make sure they try and speak up. Yeah. People tend to sort of point towards me when they speak. That does mean sometimes it's harder for people at the other end of the room to hear, so do bear that in mind. If anyone's having trouble hearing, just do let me know and we'll try and we do have microphones. We talked to you yesterday, but we only have a minute's number, so it's rather difficult passing them around, especially with this many people around the table. So we'll see how we get on. There was also a problem yesterday with the YouTube live broadcast, I understand, and a lot of effort was made to try and improve it. Another measure has been taken today using a different way in. So hopefully for people who are watching on Zoom or on YouTube, they'll be able to hear proceedings today and follow it okay. So apologies for that, problems there were for that. Sorry, so I'll just deal with that at the beginning. On my left here is colleague Sophie Edwards. She's a planning inspector who's dealt with planning appeals and other casework for a number of years, but not yet examined local plans. It's part of her training, conducting local plan examinations next year. She's spent a couple of days with us here in Europe. She was here yesterday and she's here today. But just to be clear, I'm the inspector who's solely responsible for this examination. Sophie was simply here to observe and she got involved in the decisions and recommendations that I made about the plan. Just a few housekeeping points. Please, a reminder for everyone to switch their phones and laptops to silent. The toilets are out into the main lobby area, around to the right, and then to your left under the staircase. There is no fire alarm test planned for today, so if the alarm does go off, we'll recognise it. We'll need to vacate the building, going out through one of the doors through this room, back out into the lobby, round to the left and out through the main entrance. And the assembly point is this end of the building opposite the DLR station. If anyone needs assistance in getting out of the building in that situation, have a word with one of the council officers and get to assist. Anything else from a housekeeping point of view after voluntary council? Thank you. Charlotte, the program officer, I'm sure you've been in touch with, will be around all day if you need any help about the running of the examination of this hearing session, particularly if you need assistance. So today we're dealing with the items of strategies for the start not before this afternoon, not before 2 o'clock. I don't think long this morning to do a lot to do, but if we do need to go on after lunch, we can do. So matter 4, we start with some general issues about the neighbourhoods and the allocations, but then we'll start on the first neighbourhood, neighbourhood 17 this afternoon. We'll probably have a break around 11 o'clock this morning, 15-20 minutes, and similarly we'll have a break mid-afternoon. Lunch will be around about 1 o'clock, depending on where we've got to on matter 3. Just a reminder, the purpose of the examination is to help me decide if the plan submitted on the 8th of July 2025 is legally compliant and sound, and if not, how it could be modified to ensure it is. So I'll start each agenda item with some questions to the council. When we've heard the answers to those, I'll invite contributions from others. If you wish to speak at any point in time, put your nameplate at the end, and I'll bring you in at an appropriate time. Your nameplates are nicely arranged now, and they're not typically lining water bottles and jugs, so pointing towards me, so I can see them all, in fact, I think, so that's good. So try and keep them like that if you can. And when you spoke, if you could try and go to the nameplate like that, so I can keep track of who's actually waiting to speak and who isn't. In terms of any modifications, the council has proposed some major modifications to the plan. published on, the council did publish the main modifications, or submit the main modifications to the plan, and the plan was submitted in July last year. As I explained in my notes, those were ones that they were putting forward. They weren't necessarily ones that I addressed parts of the plan that I'd identified and therefore needed to be modified. So I asked them to basically explain the plan was submitted, and if those modifications became relevant in response to issues that I identified through my questions or hearing sessions, at that point they could make modifications if they're relevant. So what we have at the moment for me, the council has proposed modifications from the council, are in the document reference number ED6, which was published on the 21st of November, which I think you've seen. Just to be clear about the ones that are most relevant for today, if I could, please, and I just run down the everyone's benefit, because we may need to refer to these as we go through the discussions. So I've got the schedule here and I've got a note. So I think the first one is FM1, which is about the site map being relabelled indicative diagrams. So that's a proposed modification from the council. FM9 is a modification proposed to policy D3, which makes additional references to efficient use of land and reference to the characterisation study and the small sites guidance. You can read the detail of these, if they're available, obviously, on the website. FM11 is a proposed modification to the diagram, the map and diagram on page 358 of the plan, which defines the neighbourhood, shows the site allocations, and the proposal is to conserve and transport areas. I'll have some questions about that, but we haven't actually got the visual representation of what that would look like. Quite a small diagram, but the principle is that they would be designated or indicated on the diagram in the plan. So we'll talk about that as we go through the agenda today. There's FM11, which is related to the same issue. It's about the paragraph 4.3, explaining what the conserving once and transform areas are. And then finally, we've got modifications, which were ones that were originally agreed as part of the common ground, I think, and proposed earlier on when the council submitted the plan, which are referenced in MO 22, 10, 12, and 15, which are to the neighbourhood policies N1, N3, N17, referring to the maximum building heights with reference to the airport and policy T4.6. So I'll just quickly run through those. I think they're the main ones relevant to what we're talking about today. If there are others, let me know. Okay, on another matter, just to clarify things, when my matters, issues and questions were published on the 9th of October, they were based on my consideration of the submitted plan, the evidence, presentations, and the council's response to my preliminary questions. So the representors' written statements would refer to that information when they put your statements in. Subsequent to that, and this is the point, you haven't had a chance to comment on these things yet, but you've had today as far as they're relevant. There are a number of documents that have been published, so I'll just quickly run through those and particularly identify the ones that may be relevant for today. ED5 is a statement of common ground with Thames Water. That will be relevant to the discussion this afternoon about Galleon's Reach neighbourhood and the allocation there. ED7 is a statement of common ground with GRA. That was relevant to what we talked about yesterday and will be relevant to when we talk about the housing figures, targets, not particularly relevant to today's discussion, I don't think. ED8 is further land supply information about allocations, which will be relevant to matter 4 and the allocation we talked about today, and will also be relevant to the other allocations we talk about the rest of tomorrow and next week. ED5 is about 5-year housing supply summary, which isn't really relevant to this week or next, but more relevant when we come on to looking at the overall supply and 5-year supply situation and one of the matters that we're dealing with in January, I can't remember the number. And finally, there was some viability information that wasn't really new, but it was packaged up in a different way we talked about yesterday, and that's in documents ED 10, 11 and 12. Okay, so I just thought I'd run through that. Just to hear about. I'm aware that you've not had a chance to comment on some of that. Probably made relevant. So obviously, you can talk about it today as politically relevant. Just a final, well, to let people know, at the end of each week, or possibly at the end of if we've got 2 consecutive weeks, I will welcome. Sorry, I didn't mean to say before I went too far. I understood there were some delays on the DLR, so that may be why some people have been invited late. So apologies if I've started before everyone's here, but we haven't actually got beyond the introductions yet. Sorry, at the end of either this week and or next week, I will issue a note with some action points, which are just to clarify certain things that I'll be asking the council or possibly others to be doing as a result of the discussions we've had. It won't necessarily be the end of the matter on all of the issues that we talked about, but it will be ones that I feel are really helpful to set out something. Maybe so that things can keep moving and that the council can respond to that before we come back to subsequent hearing sessions, because their response will inform what we talk about later in January and February. So just let people know that's the case. Right, to be pleased to know I'm finished saying what I need to say, I think. So we'll now go around the room if I could and allow everyone to introduce themselves, starting with the council, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lily Mahoney, a principal planner at Newham.
I'm Chintzilla Vincenzi, Specialty Young.
I'm Felont, principal planner at Newham.
I'm Danny Evelyn, interim planning policy manager at Newham.
Justin Emily, director at Stantec Limited, and just here representing the sector. Michael Smith, representing notes for Vector Retail.
Could you turn your name, please, so I can see it? Thank you very much.
I'm Kenny Bean, Super Bean, that's on behalf of Western.
Westlake Super Architects.
Client director quantity on behalf of
James from KC, I'm a barrister and I'm representing, we're going to refer to as AIF.
Okay, thank you.
So Emma Lawrence, also representing AIF, I am a heritage town statement.
Matt Rose from North Planning, representing the Night Group. Hi, Phil Rochelle, director of Object Planning, representing Guy Walker.
Hi, Chris Gaskell, the board director at Deacon and also Town Principal.
I remember the Friends of Queens.
James Stevens, Home Builders Federation.
Andrew Testament, head of planning, London Place Development Corporation.
And Mona Keane, the family manager.
Okay, welcome all. I could just about hear everyone. I don't know if everyone can hear each other, just about. But I do try and speak up because the acoustics are reasonable in this room. There is a bit of background noise, and it is quite a big room. And some people are some distance away, so we'll carry on. If you've got something to hear, we may have to bring the microphones back out. Right, okay. So that was with the introductions. But before I turn to the first item on the agenda, are there any queries, procedural points anybody wishes to raise at this stage before we get going? No, good. Okay. Right. So we're dealing now with the first item on the agenda, spatial strategy. And I had a number of questions in this relating to this that you responded to, and I'm going to go through those questions. On the agenda, I've kind of categorised them as spatial strategy BFN1, neighbourhood enhanced areas, but I can also cover neighbourhood transform and conserve areas, because the mapping changes that the council has proposed. And then we're going to come on to the tall buildings also. The reason I've put tall buildings in with the spatial strategy is because the way I see it really, it's a three-dimensional spatial strategy in its plan. It's, it's the where, it's also how high. So it feels it's a relevant place to deal with this before we then move on to talk about allocations and how the strategy is articulated through those. So that's why it's been done in that way, rather than leaving the tall buildings policy to a development management policy under the design section of the plan. So that's how I sort of see that. And I may as well say, not to don't forget, actually, on the tall buildings, I'll sort of break it down into 4 parts, which broadly reflects the sort of question of the issue. So I'll say it now just so you need to think about it. It will be later this morning. The first one is about how the zones are identified, so the geographical extent, where they are in the borough and their geographical extent. Not particularly individuals, but the approach. And then on to policy D4 and what it says about development outside the zones and development within the zones, i.e. in the zones, maximum heights. Maximum heights and prevailing heights. So that, and then any other elements would policy B4, and it's more detailed criteria, but that may not be so spend so much longer. And then there will be an opportunity to deal with any specific issues to do with specific zones and specific heights. But, well, we'll see where we get to with that. I mean, we're going to deal with each allocations as we go through the matter 4. So some of that is probably better left to that. But it's primarily about the way that D4 is structured and the general approach that I'm going to focus on today. Okay, so back to the first item on the agenda then, which is about the spatial strategy. In essence, I'm taking questions 3.1, 3.3 and 3.4 together, really, here. So the basic point about BFN1 and the approach to spatial strategy is, it's based on the characterisation study and the neighbourhood approach. That's the geographical sort of analysis of the borough, and it's based on the principles in the London plan around design and character-led approach to accommodate growth, a strong focus on the opportunity areas that are identified in the London plan, the approach to small sites in the London plan's good growth objectives. That's in very simple terms and sort of the strategic context for what the borough have done, yeah? Okay. And as I say, the characterisation study 2024, that's document BA 2021, they identified the neighbourhoods and different approaches to reflect the character of those areas and the opportunities to accommodate the significant levels of growth that we talked about yesterday in principle that Newham is accommodating. So I'm going to now then talk about transform areas and the enhanced areas. Is there anything more generally about that broad BFN1 approach that anybody wishes to say at this stage? Anything else to say to anyone else? Or sort of delve into more of the detail?
Just BFN1, we think it's an appropriate spatial strategy that sets out where and how growth and development should happen across the area. And as we mentioned before, it's based on the characterization study, which is quite detailed, which is really and I think it represents an appropriate spatial strategy.
Yes, okay. And that strategy was one of 4 that were considered through the integrated impact assessment. So reasonable alternatives, as far as there were identified. I don't need to go through those. I don't think there's been any real quibble that wasn't alternatives assessed, but that was done, wasn't it?
It was done, yes.
Yeah. So anything anybody wishes to say, generally about that sort of overall spatial, 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional as well, but leave the 3-dimensional element to it and to the general approach. No, okay. Right, so can I come on then to the transform areas and the enhanced areas? And obviously, there is they are reflected in certain policy wording in the plan. So what I want to explore first is the transform areas. So at the moment, they're not defined. No? Not explicitly,
Not explicitly correct. What we suggested in response to your suggestion that we should be having enhanced areas was to actually map all 3 of the character areas.
Understood.
And therefore they would be set out. What I would say is that if you look at the characterization study assessment and how we usually use it, you will identify the majority our site allocations are transport allocations. In a way, they're already mapped.
Yes.
With a few exceptions.
So they're already mapped in the plan.
Yes, but they're not noted as
No.
transform areas as such.
So the idea is that you would reflect the characterization study by adding to the diagram or the map, the neighbourhoods.
Yes, correct.
Understood. So that would be the ones that are shown in the characterization study. So I'm going to pick an example in a minute, and we're going to have a look at that. So the definition of the transformation areas is what, in simple terms? Is it defined in the plan or is it defined in the characterization study?
It's in the characterization study,
Yeah.
but we do have a definition, broad definition as part of policy.
Right. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I will read it. So I read exactly.
Yeah. It's a big plan, you see.
I know, it's in the implementation section, it's just.
I can say,
Yeah, transform areas are defined
Oh,
as
yeah.
areas that have the conditions to establish a character. It's very simple definition. It's a lot more complicated in the characterization study. Basically, what we've done is had a look at the morphology of RO and also our characteristics in terms of functionality, socioeconomics, following the character and growth local plan guidance. And what the transform areas are areas where there isn't necessarily a specific strong character, and there is potential through development to create that strong identity character. And because of less constraints in the wider area, there is also potential to be more transformative compared to other parts of the borough where there are more constraints related to existing.
Yeah, okay. Understood, and that's why there's a strong overlap with the opportunity areas defined in the moving plan and the site allocation in the plan. Understood, yeah. Okay. I'm going to talk about Queen's Market in relation to this, but just before I do, is there anything anybody wishes to say just generally about that principle of identifying the transform areas and that sort of definition? I mean, it's an opportunity-based approach to accommodating products, which create new characters. No, okay. So in terms of an example and a specific concern that Queen's Market has, in the characterization study, the market is, let me just put up the map. Yeah, there's a map, and this is what, I mean, this is an example of how the plan may be reflected through these designations. So there's a map in the section 14, which is chapter 8, which is part 3 of chapter 8, I think, which has a conserve enhanced transformer map, and that shows how this will be reflected on the map in the plan. So the green shading, which is an enhanced area, conserve area is shown, and then there's the transform area. Now, in this particular case, the transform area is a very specific block, which seems to be the market. So what's the rationale for that?
I might need some help. Yes.
Basically, when we did the analysis of the morphology and the building types, that specific development which is existing, it was identified as a poor quality, so as a potential transformation. This is basically, it's not related to the value, the social value of the market itself. It's more related to the building types and the quality of the building. It doesn't mean that it's going to be redeveloped as a new building. also some refurbishment will come forward from the regeneration team, but this is mainly the reason why it has been identified as a transform area.
I mean, other transport areas, I mean, that discreetly defined or more broadly defined generally?
Sometimes there are specific, especially when they are located to infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay, so there's nothing more to it than that. That's it. That it was just the significance of that as a big site or building complex that needs to be transformed and improved, but it doesn't have any particular implication in terms of it's not a specific proposal as such. We might come back on that because it's also a tall building zone. It isn't an allocation. No, okay. Right, any plans of Queen Market? Let's bring you in on this particular issue about the transform area. Anything you want to add? You've obviously read what you said, and you want to just explain about the concerns that you have about that.
Yes, I don't know whether to go backwards.
Not too far.
I mean, or I could just say what I was going to say all the way through. But in terms of what you've just said, the allocation was removed as an allocation because the council says it is still looking for possible uses and what type of development may take place. So you'll have seen their explanation of why it's no longer an allocation. So then why are they determining the form of development by making it a tall building zone?
Can we come on to the tall building zone?
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to it on then, but specifically on this issue of identifying as a transform area, subject to what the policy is for that.
And I think the two go together.
They do, but I'm going to deal specifically with tall building zone later.
And it also says in the mayor's policy that a transform area doesn't necessarily contain tall buildings. So I think it's
so
it doesn't make sense.
We'll come on to the tall building zone. But do you have any concern about it being designated as a transform?
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got a lot to say about that.
Transform?
Yes.
Right. So what's the concern about transform?
Because what does that mean?
Well, it means what the plan says. So you tell me what you think it means.
Well, if you look at the characterization study, it's completely contradictory all the way through about the market. 1 minute it's saying...
Okay, I've read that and I've heard what you said about that. I want to know what it is in the plan, the policies about transform areas, and you think are not applicable.
Because it's talking about changing a new character to the area, whereas actually what we have there is a very strong character, which just needs looking after, the buildings need looking after. But the character is created by what's there, the people, and everything to do with its social value and what it provides. And therefore, if a passerby looks at the buildings and thinks that they haven't been painted recently, well, there are a number of reasons for that. It's certainly not a reason to transform the whole thing, which is liable to lose the thing that is there and very precious.
Okay, no, thank you. That clarifies it very clearly to me. So it's your objection is policy says in areas identified as sequel transformation of character, and the definition of a transformation area is that if you would have the conditions to substantiate a new character, it's the character that you can be not thrown away and recreated as something new.
Yes.
We'll come back to the tall building zone element of it as well.
Sorry,
no, that's fine. Right.
Yeah, just see if I can add something that, it's true that, defining as a transform area means that we can't change the character, but we also have policy HS4 on the plan that protects the market.
I know.
Yeah. It's
just, I suppose the question really is, what is identified as a transform area actually doing? Is it not a reflection of the fact that it was previously an allocation in the plan?
All the site allocation are also had an influence on the transformation.
Yeah. It's not a legacy of that. Right, okay. Right. Anything else on transform areas? We're going to move on to enhance areas. So these are most of the borough, and certainly most of the bits around allocations or opportunities or things like that. So anyway, but the issue here, I think, is what the policy is to enhance areas, which essentially, BFN, we've got two expressions of it. I think essentially it's a moderate uplift in density is one of the elements of the policy for enhanced areas. Yeah. So I suppose the question about that is that sufficiently positive about accommodating growth outside the transform areas, where clearly there's a much more positive approach to accommodating growth at some extent. So do you want to just explain why that is the appropriate phrase?
I will start by pointing out to the response so that you can see, which includes a lot of the details around this. It's alignment with the approach to London plan. In line with what comes out of the characterization study assessment, the vast majority of the borough is an enhanced area. This actually means that there are very different kinds of characters within this enhanced area. So you have terraces as well as the area around here, which is like 8 to 10 stories high. And because of this, being more prescriptive would not be an effective way to manage what is in effect or wonderful sites going forward. So the approach is more flexible by using this terminology, but it doesn't mean that we be considering going lower than what's existing or considering a density that is not within keeping with the idea of enhancing an area. So in that sense, we believe that across the policies in the plan, in terms of design, we are able to optimize capacity in an efficient way. Even if we don't say specific density range. In a further regard, and I will note the application forward, yes, a lot of these sites are relatively small sites, and that means that they will be guided by guidance of the plan, and also we prepared our own small sites intensification guidance. If you look there, you will find references to how things could be enhanced and the capacity linked in the area, and we're definitely not shying away from development if you look at it.
Yeah, okay. So it's a balance between conservation of the character, but it's accommodating growth. So that is clear from the D3 part 5, isn't it? That's the main policy. In BFN 1B, it refers to supporting incremental change in the various neighbourhoods that aren't in the opportunity areas, and it talks about enhancement to each neighbourhood's character. Now, those neighbourhoods will be mostly enhanced areas, won't they? Not all, but they're outside the opportunity areas. So, if that policy applies to those neighbourhoods, it's not directly relating to the areas within it. It's a big gap. That makes sense. So
I understand what you mean. Like, does the policy apply versus the enhanced areas?
Yeah.
That are specific geography?
So you've got incremental change and you've got moderate uplift. I mean, they're not contradictory, I don't suppose they're inconsistent, but they don't necessarily relate to exactly the same geographical areas. It's just a matter of using this plan to hold more bits of it. Anyway, okay, right. Anyone else want to say anything on enhancement? Yes, I thought so. That's it, William, mate.
Yeah, I think the enhanced areas
does feel like it's a bit unclear as how many leftover jobs of what's in the transform areas and what's not in the conserved areas. The definition says that they are areas of mixed quality where new developments are constituted to open parameter and moderate uplifting density as part of development, which suggests that significant uplift is not positive, which I think jars a little bit with the framework, which sees significant uplift in density anyway. So it does feel like this category is perhaps not ambitious enough in line with policy BFN1. And there are also a number of site allocations which enhance area, not transform areas. So town gasworks, which is a big enough site which is capable to be subject to transformation, still following a design-led approach. So it feels like there's a slightly inconsistent approach in the designation of site allocations as transform areas and site allocations as enhance areas, notwithstanding comments about flexibility and intention so that we can rise on a site-by-site basis.
Well, I suppose we can think when we talk about an allocation in an enhanced area such as the Eastham Gasworks, we can think about how these many policies interact with each other. Okay. So the point understood anyway. HPF, we made a point about quantifying the incremental change.
Yes, it's not so much about quantifying it, because I recognise that the council strategy is to steer the majority of the development, or in terms of where it's identified capacity, is to those transform areas. The question is about how that also relates to supporting the London Plan objective in policy H1, which is to ensure that you optimise residential delivery in all areas across London where there is identified ground for capacity, but particularly where it's within P-Towers 3 to 6, 800 metres from a train station, or within a town centre boundary. And so I've got no objection to the council having identified where the majority of its residential capacity is in those transform areas. It's kind of what the plan is saying about the extent to which it will entertain residential applications outside of those areas, and particularly I focused on the FM1 spatial strategy part P, where it says supporting incremental change in N9 West Ham, N10 Plaistow, N11 Benton, N12 East Ham South, N13 East Ham, N14 Green Street, N15 Forest Gate, N16 Adam Park, and Little Ilford, which seem to me to be quite significant parts of the borough, where there is probably a lot of brownfield land potential. And I think the London Plan, the London Plan's very clear at H1 that it really is about optimising as much residential development across the borough as possible. And it's not just about those P-Town 3-6 areas. Policy H1B2 of the London Plan, it also refers to looking at opportunities for mixed use redevelopment of car parks, low density retail parks and supermarkets, housing, etc. You can read it for yourself. Yeah. So it's not just P-Town 3 to 6 and 800 metres in district and translation. There are other opportunities there. And I'm sure it is the council's intention that it will not resist development in those locations, but the way that the plan is couched at the moment is that you could say, well, we're meeting our housing requirements, so we don't need to entertain an application of those modeling areas. And I think we probably need a statement to the effect in the local plan that it supports the principle of the London Plan that will look favourably at applications outside of the transform areas.
Except the London Plan policies remain, don't they? Statutory development plan. So they're not superseded by this. Well, in decision making, I suppose, if there was a conflict, these being more recently adopted,
That's the way it kind of plays out.
But I don't think that, well, I suppose that's the issue, is are these actually consistent with, or just slightly different? You know, they're a tier, another tier, aren't they, in this vastly planned London with these two big plans?
Yeah, I understand. It is the council's kind of, it is the council's practical implementation of the policies
Yeah,
in the local plan. And as I said, I'm quite sure it isn't the council's intention to resist schemes like that, but I'm just worried about the possibility that it could be interpreted.
And I get a material policy as well, because when we come to the neighbourhood policies, which is N9 to N16, got a neighbourhood policy which says various things about that area, and they vary as well in terms of the approach. Yeah, lots of policies to apply, and I take your point about how it will be interpreted. I mean, other than if it's unclear, well, yeah, council.
Just to say on the point of specifically housing, net optimisation of sites, policy H1.2 does specifically talk about optimising capacity through a site-led approach on all sites delivering housing. So we don't envisage the spatial strategy being a barrier to application of that policy.
And I'm not examining this small site intensification guidance, but it is referred to in an appropriate way. And just, I mean, that is the purpose of that is to achieve this balance, I suppose, i.e. the balance between optimising density but avoiding development out of character. So, another layer of things. Right, so, have you thought about how these transform, and have you had a go at mapping it yet?
No,
Do they work?
We haven't mapped it yet, but we can look.
We would suggest that it's fairly similar to what is currently in part 2 of chapter 7, the section study, where they are mapped.
On one plan for the whole world, is it? I was
Yes.
looking at the end of it, chapter 8.
Yes, so we
Yeah.
translate that map and color it to merge it of sorts with the one we have in the neighborhood section. Identify so it would be like a color background.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And you've also got the allegations marked up, so that's in
Yes.
red, and they've got the numbers on as well with the pink shading. Well, we can try, can't really see how it looks. What may get rather, but the principle, and the principle of not putting them on the policies map, because you don't want them to be more than diagrammatic, really.
Yes.
You don't want an OS
Because,
space
I
because
mean, we know what the methodology is from the characterization study, but character was assessed on the basis of what's existing at the time we did the characterization study, and that once it shifted to future, things will evolve in various places across the borough. Therefore, we want to retain that kind of flexibility in order to optimize the sites available. Therefore, we welcome a kind of negotiation, and that's already in the implementation section of D3, where we say if you believe your character should be different from what we identified, come and discuss that with us based on the characterization studies and methodology, and see if we get something else. So there is flexibility into the process to allow.
and why would that flexibility not be possible if they were put on the OS base of the policies map?
Because they could be, because they are also like the flood zones, they also change, right? So
I know, it's always this thing about policy map, isn't it?
is it though effective? Because at least the enhanced area, it covers the majority of the borough. So it would be one large block, and what that's legible.
But if you mapped the conserve areas and the transform areas, isn't everything else enhanced area?
We could do it that way as well, but it would also overlap with many other designations, and it would make it even less legible, I would think. So we have a bit of a problem in terms of.
But the policy map, you can take the layers on and off, can't you?
In a GIS format, yes, we do have to.
Okay.
I think also just on that point is that some of the we were saying on the flexibility, if it was rigid, that's what we designated. There are certain areas that the character is changing quite greatly within the borough, and I think we didn't want to keep it so rigid. But there is potential for some areas to shift over the next plan.
The neighbourhood plans, I suppose they're always supposed to, aren't they? So if you showed one there, they'd be putting that sort of hard boundaries. The page 358 neighbourhood map, because you are done.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, yeah, right. Any other comments from anyone else on this issue about in-house transform reserve areas, spatial strategy, and the mapping issues that we talked about? Or we'll move on to the next item, which is buildings. Shall we see as well?
I would say that
Yes.
with them being so flexible and so movable, how is really anyone on campsite meant to know what they are, or whether they're in one, or what the decision is going to be on one of them, and also from the point of view of consulting with that. I don't think how anyone's supposed to know what they are then either.
Well, I think the idea is that they would know because they'd be shown on this map.
Right.
And I think the point of the flexibility would come was if you're a developer and you say outside a transport area, but you feel you can justify they should be subject to transformation for whatever reason, the council will be flexible, and that in that case, that's probably it. So they would be shown. So it would provide. At the moment, it's completely unclear, isn't it? Because the reference to these are things in the plan, but we don't know what they are. So if they were shown, it would provide a degree.
I was just talking about who looks at the plan prior to at this stage.
Oh, well, yes, that's part of it. There will be a consultation. If a main modification is to be made to the plan that I think is necessary, there will be consultation on it, and therefore there would be then the opportunity to comment on something that you couldn't really easily comment on before. It wasn't there. Okay, is that? Yes. Right. So we'll move on to the tall buildings. And as I said, I want to look at this in a number of parts. So please, hold back on your comments if necessary to reflect that. The tall building zones are defined on the policies map. First, sorry, one step back. The tall building is over 20 buildings, and that's the definition. But just the stories is indicative because it's the meters that sets the definition, and that's clear enough. And the characterisation study, in particular, tall buildings annex, is the background and the evidence for this, so that both the geographical mapping of the zones and the heights within them. And then we've got topic paper T1, which was prepared in response to the Regulation 19 representations. And that goes back through the story about how they were and the evidence, but it also responds to all of the main points made by the Regulation 19 reps, and that's quite a thorough bit of assessment of the reps, so people will have a chance to see that, and we can talk about those as we need to. And we've got London Plan Policy D9, the key London Plan Policy, parts of that. But we also have the GLA Characterisation and Growth Strategy London Plan Guidance document. So they're the context for this. Right, I'm going to just go through what I understand the process and the justification for the. So, sorry, as I said, first thing I'm doing here is talk about how the zones, not the heights of them are necessary, but more the geographical extent of the zones are identified. So I can understand that. So there are a lot of criteria that we looked at that I've listed in anyway. So these were the relevant factors, or the most, and tell me if there's anything missing or So areas of consistency tall buildings, no sensitivity to change, transform areas, site allocations, opportunity areas, areas identified in tall buildings in the adopted plan, PTL 4 to 6B, town and local centres. So that led to a sort of mapping of them. And then there were sort of sitting out certain things, which were things like conservation areas, green spaces, metropolitan open land, civil aviation authority, safety, local PTL, unless in not the opportunity area. And then certain other things were taken into account. So areas with isolated or few tall buildings or tall structures such as holders. So they were sipped out. Things with planning permission were not taken as definite or as part of the existing character, because it could change and it's there yet. So we'll come back to that. I think there are no points made about that. It did take account of the adjoining boroughs, looked all around policies and the nature of development in the adjoining boroughs and mapped that out. And things. So that's relevant to some of the points. And it took account of the London View Management Framework as well. The long views across Stratford areas for St Paul's. I think one of the long views So those are things that work. So that led to a defined suitability map, which I thought was figure 34, which I assume was from the characterizations that began in tall buildings.
Yes.
Yeah. So that suitability area that's shaded degrees of suitability. Darker shades of blue.
Yes. Yeah. Basically, the darkest is the most.
More of those factors are overlapping.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's okay. Understood.
That is also like related then to the hierarchy.
Yeah. Okay. So then we get to the tall building zones, which is on the policies map and on the map plan and on the map annex. And there, so that from the suitability areas, to get to that. This is where I'm not sure what happened. How we got to these particular zones. There doesn't seem to be a list of those, and it's a policy related to each in the plan. There doesn't seem to be an explanation for each zone, how its boundary, how it was selected, and its boundary.
I mean, the boundary is related sometimes with site allocation that were available, and also like setting the boundary against conservation area that would exclude from building areas. And yeah, it's a reflection of what has been assessed in the market before. But yeah, it's also related to site allocation available strategic industrial land that have been included in the building areas. And reflects the transform area as well.
Is there a map between the suitability area and the TBZ map?
No.
There's nothing bridging that gap?
No.
Okay. Well, if anyone's got any comments about that, say so. And there's not a justification anywhere for each TBZ explaining why that one was chosen in regard to these factors, and this is where the boundaries really are.
Not specifically for each one, but basically drawn from the analysis that has
What
been
I've described.
before. Yeah.
Right. And most of the zones are, the zone implies a kind of fairly broad area. Quite a lot of them in the policies map. I'll just get it back up. Okay, but there are a few exceptions which are quite small, discrete areas, and I'm going to come back to Queen's Market in a minute. But I'll just pick two examples. I just want to understand why these quite small zones were designated with regard to the factors that I referred to. The TVZ3, East Ham.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's got maximum height of 32 metres. There's no allocation in it. So that's not that. It's is it transform area?
It is area. It's enhanced. It's an enhanced area.
It's enhanced. It's within the major centre.
Yes, it is.
And Vital is high.
Yeah, it's a high peak. Yeah.
And the prevailing, because that word seems to mean the existing character, height character is.
It's a mix. It has a kind of low density, low rise buildings around, but then the site that has been identified as a living area is actually more reflecting what has been developed in the recent years. So I think at the point in time when we did the assessment was in context, so it was designated as a living area, although there isn't really much margin now to develop in that area.
Because most of the tall buildings
it's already built, most of the area is already built.
Okay, understood that one. And let's go on to Green Street then, which is a small tall building zone. Seems to be coincidental with the transform area.
Yeah.
Market.
Yeah, it's a market, and yeah, as you were saying, it was a site allocation. So when we did the assessment, it was also something that was taken into account to define within the area. Yeah.
So going through some of the criteria then. It's a transform area for the reasons you said before. It's within the Green Street Centre. It's part of the shopping centre.
Yep.
Yeah, shopping town centre. Retail.
It's a high Vital.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And height character of the area.
It's medium rise. It has some new development on the same street.
Tall buildings.
Yes.
All existing.
Yeah, up to 16 stories. Yeah.
Meters.
It's
more than 21. Okay, thank you. And the sensitive context.
It's not sensitive to change. Yeah, I think it was related also to that analysis of the morphology and the people. So it has been identified as a low sensitive to change area.
So, notwithstanding the fact that part of the justification was that there was an allocation, and that's gone, you still think it's appropriate for a tall building zone?
It's a very high Vital, so it can be a very good location for potentially future development.
Vital.
Yeah. And it's a town center location, so it meets all the criteria identified by the London plan to be an area of transformation and higher density.
But it's premised on the fact that it could be redeveloped.
Yes.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it wouldn't
Because
be redeveloped.
there's lots of other bits of land within the high street that meet the same criteria.
Yeah.
So it's only suitable as a tall building zone if it counts. It seems to be only suitable as a tall building zone if it's allocated for development. It seems to be a bit of Queen's market. You've heard what I've said. Do you want to ask anything else?
Yes, please, I would. First of all, I thought that you just clarified that, I thought the inspector asked to clarify that the previous allocation wasn't a factor in the choice of this one, and you said it wasn't. So I don't understand. You said both things.
Yeah, no, what I mean is that we are not, when we did, at the point in time when we did the assessment, we consider all the transform area, all the site allocation, and all these elements have been considered to identify suitable location for buildings. And in that point in time, it was a site allocation. And then we took it out, but we didn't change the outcome of our consideration because it was still a high PTAL and met other criteria. That's the
In terms
answer.
of the PTAL, I understood that it's described as an only moderate transport accessibility. It's only moderate. Is that very high? I don't think it's very high.
Well, the criteria was PTAL 4 to 6B.
Yeah.
What specifically is this location?
Interesting. Do you want me to check now or come back?
Well, later is fine.
Yeah.
And sorry, Friends of Queen's Market, carry on.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, can I
Yes.
come back? It's 5.
So it's clearly within the range that
Yes.
meets the criteria. But so are other parts of the town centre, obviously, to say.
Moderate. Well, just going back to this, we don't think it's justified to put a tall building there because it encourages a complete change. It encourages a form of development which might not be the right one, and it means that there's no choice, any other choice of effectively what to do. A tall building will kind of completely change, as we know, the character of the neighbourhood. That's what they do. And so it's inappropriate for this site. That's what we've said all along.
Understood.
Just a couple of other things about which are also general. One is that the characterization and growth study is very clear about, which you've mentioned, is very clear about the involvement of people being involved in how these things are determined, how the sieving process works, and that is you need to take into account the needs of specific groups. You need 3 distinct stages of community engagement, which are carefully written down. On page 4, Street is actually cited in the list of elements of character, where it says places and spaces that are valued by the community, actually name check Green Street. And we wanted to let you know that the consultations on the character study were done in 2001, during which was the COVID Omicron outbreak, and it was a very difficult time for everyone, and there were also many other consultations running online. It was very confusing. It was a terrible time to consult, and we are unaware of any local plan presentations about Queen's Market as that site, which is what specifically the characterisation and growth strategy asks you to do, and to collect this evidence with the help of people. And if you have done that, I think that would be the majority thought. So I think full decision making on this, the council has failed to carry out the process correctly.
Okay, thank you.
And there's one more point.
Yes, please.
Which is about the word zone. This is not in keeping with the London plan, because the London plan asks boroughs to identify locations suitable for tall buildings, to assess the potential visual and ecological impacts with the aid of modelling and such. But a zone is a much wider area than the location, and it's unclear whether any exercises like that.
Okay. Yeah, I've got that point. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I think I understand the issues, and sorry, you wanted to come back. and then I'll come down to the end.
Yes, I might be able to come back on the bits and pieces, but for now, this was in relation to the zone and the heritage study. I will draw your attention to chapter 8, part 3, which is including the description of how the character assessment on Green Street as a neighborhood. And this is where the areas of concern can transform on the table. That's page 251. And it specifically mentions this before any kind of mapping of tall buildings. There's a specific mention for marking the station with a small number of tall buildings around the station to support the character of the area. But this is before having so this is under the transform character assessment of it, identifying potential for the transformation of tall buildings there. Tall building zone was allocated here.
But even this seems to be premised on an allocation being there. The description that you've just given me.
I agree, it feels like that. When you go to talk about the rest of the tall building zones, and including some of them that are in implement designations, the idea is that like to be able to apply sites and when they come forward, irrespective of whether currently we know for sure that they will be developer interest or not. This helps us optimize things as and when things move forward based on the existing character rather than solely on what we've been able to allocate in the plan based on developer interest as they currently are.
Okay. Sorry, I interrupted you. Was there anything else?
I think for now, no. I still have to.
Queen's Market again, just quickly, and then I'll give a chance for others to come in. Well, no, because I think we're related. If you're still relating it to.
No, it's kind of general.
Well, no, go on.
Okay.
Go.
Sorry, guys.
It's
I've
okay.
just been confused. I thought we were doing it a different way.
No, oh, sorry.
Okay, we think the sieving exercise has actually misinterpreted the outlining plan because on page 58 of the building annex says town centres are identified in the plan as suitable locations to accommodate residential development. Therefore, areas designated as town centres are considered suitable for building development. So we think this conclusion is not what the London plan is saying. It's not what we looked at. It acknowledges in S6 that there is a potential for new housing, obviously, in town centres and on the edges, and in emphasis on the town centre first approach. But there is no reference to tall buildings in relation to town centres. So I think that's not a suitable starting point for them to have on page 15.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, just to clarify that the seeding exercise that we undertook is based on the characterization of LPG, which lists all the elements that we have to check to understand if the site is suitable for buildings, and this includes
Yeah, and that was the list I went through,
yes,
reading it, there were
exactly.
various things, and that led to the wider suitability,
Yes, exactly.
and then within that you jump to these zones. That's where there's a bit of a gap in the explanation. I think I've identified. Okay, let me go down the other end of the table, then let's go to AMR. Yeah, Andrew Mann.
Thank you, James Strawn for AEIM. So can I just make one general remark and then deal specifically with the question of building code?
Yes.
The general remark is picking up on your initial comment about spatial strategy, the spatial strategy. We would say that's a very accurate summary of the approach the council's adopted here, because unusually it does set prescriptive policies, both on the ground, on the boundaries, and you're referring to, but also in terms of ceilings, like the walls and that ceiling. And so I'm going to come back to expect the ceiling.
Yeah, we will, yeah.
But just sticking with this question of boundaries.
Yeah.
I think it's right to recognise that the council is not treating them as zones, broad areas, because in the plan there are lines drawn on the plan to reflect tall building zones, but demarcated. And the policy expressly states that you're outside the demarcated policy. You're therefore contrary effectively to the plan for tall building. And so that brings, and we say you're going to do that, it's an unusual approach, if you're going to do that, you've got to have a very robust evidence base to explain why, for example, a tall building that sits just outside that, I'll show you an example of this, is contrary to policy, as opposed to having no way of flexibility suggest it's very good. But if you go down this line, you've got to then justify your and have sound evidence base. That brings you on to the second point. And looking at it from a slightly different perspective to the examples you gave, obviously I'm going to give you an example on my side that it probably applies to other sites. If you take TVZ 16, which is Abbey Mills, you'll see in our representations, I've got the plan, but TVZ 16 is the brown line.
Yeah.
And of course, it doesn't reflect allocation. So it's doing it's an inconsistent approach to the one you were referring to. Because here we have part of our site that's excluded from the tall building zone, particularly to the left. Our site is slightly odd shape. And that borders undoubtedly tall structures and structures, but tall buildings on the Bromley by gas hopper site. And just thinking therefore about these zones and whether they're sound based, we find it completely disappointing. There's no explanation as to why that brown line has been drawn as it has. If there isn't any, we were looking simply for the explanation of how we get to this area. Who's decided the line on the plan? And why? What's the reason? And if you want to draw a line on the plan, you've got to explain it. Yes, if you go slightly to the left, it's probably multiple why. And if you look at this, that line to the left, our site extends along, yes, thinner and thinner, but certainly the very significant part of the site is surrounded by tall buildings to the south, and the castle site up to 37 metres. Under this current policy, tall buildings, 38, sorry, and in any event, I'm just using the question of the plan-led approach. Why on earth would a tall building on that part of the site be treated as a building? Obviously, contrary to the development plan. That doesn't make any sense. We then have the, I don't want to expand too far, but just on the zones, if you're looking for a rationale beyond what's actually stated, it gets more confusing because we eliminate the legacy opportunity area actually covers the entirety of our site, where you will struggle to find any game of the Olympic legacy opportunity area in the characterizations that you left off. And when you go to those criteria about suitability of zones, we take all the policies effectively in terms of the local centres designated on the site. We've got the opportunity area, which is a focus of growth. And yet you get this tall building now, which is arbitrarily, we would say, drawn on the plan. And that wouldn't matter if you had a flexible policy, which wasn't so broad sense, the way you describe broad areas. But that's not what we do.
Yeah, okay, understood. And we will be going through each site allocation in due course, and it will be an opportunity to pick up the detail. But in the way that I used an example to understand, how we got to these, it's another reasonable example. I've got the map, I see the brown line, and I still have the same lack of clarity how you jumped on the suitability zone being broader to these lines.
And so I'm conscious that that will talk about our side.
Yeah.
It is, I was using it as
fine. Yeah,
that's not what I know.
Yeah. Okay. So William.
I'm not going to say what I'm going to say, but if I can talk about East Town again, as an example.
Yeah.
So, just as a general comment, we support designation. You said for our other gas sites, all of our sites, with the exception of East Town, are with we've got specific detailed comments on heights, which I'm sure we can do. I think we feel that there's an inconsistent approach taken to East Town gasworks. It is an allocated site like the other gaswork sites capable of making substantial development, which will obviously need to follow a design-led approach and design-led scrutiny. It's an important contribution to housing delivery, so obviously H1 plan sets out those things.
So I want to let you explain it, but I understand that the council in its topic paper 1 addressed your points,
Yeah.
and I think it ended up with some outstanding issues that it says these are the main reasons, and they refer to East Town location being mainly low-rise, close to a nature conservation site, limited public transport accessibility, and it addresses the reason why a gas holder isn't a tall building. So I want to just focus on those things because you've not had a chance to.
So, starting with the existing structures, the existing gas holder site, which extends to the stories. There are two relevant decisions that writing gasworks filters pursuing, which confirms that existing, in that instance, gas holder structures are material considerations when considering the suitability of buildings or gaswork device, the some single decision. So confirms the same findings, not in relation to the gas holder in that instance. Addressing the accessibility point, it's excluded because it has a lower detail 46, which is identified. That doesn't mean it's inaccessible. And the London plan has a threshold of 800 metres distance to public transport, which affects Riverside Phase 1, and East Town Campus is below that threshold. So one would argue that it is accessible. And the final point is around the low-rise context. It is a substantial site, it's called a gasworks site, so it is sizable. And we would argue that it's capable of taking development, having its own character, which still needs to be cognizant of its surroundings.
Okay, no, understood, thank you. I mean, I think the point about the gas holder, 2 points from the council. One, in principle, whether they're the same as buildings, when you take into account, okay, I get the point you made about case law, on the field decisions. But the other one about, more generally, isolated tall buildings or structures don't necessarily bring you to being suitable for tall buildings. Right, so I'm still focusing on, we dealt with that because it's another example of how you select areas, and we've been through that, I think, on that. Ballymore, yeah.
Thanks, sir. And possibly unintended consequences of the approach to these building zones, but information at councils. One of the 4 sites Ballymore did was called very successful previously allocated sites, large outline consent, 90% built out. But there are 2 plots left, one which is Ballymore's ownership, one which is not. There is a current planning application in on that site. And of course, the new plan, old plan, supported tall buildings. And there are buildings up to 18 stories on that site, right down on the, just by the docks around the riverside. The current application that's in is for a 12-story building. But of course, we're outside the tall buildings, like a new concept. It's not being counted in the tall building zones. It is a quirk of the system, and it's one that perhaps is just one to interrogate a little bit through this process, because whilst the vast majority of development has occurred there are still some remaining pieces of developable land that now sit outside that tall building zone, even though there is an established tall building context around it. And I guess the only reason I flag that now, because that sort of comes up to the point about how tall buildings are being defined in the tall building policy, where they're acceptable and when they're not. Because the quote would be, if you read the policies as they sit now explicitly, it would almost say it wouldn't be appropriate in here because it exceeds the tall building. It's not so it's a strange work and either remedy it by extending tall buildings to include areas which have established tall buildings in it. Or, a different approach to the
wording of the policy, which I'll come on to. But in terms of, so you said it would have been, the reason you got permission that development took place with tall buildings in it was because the adopted plan.
Previously allocated site, adopted plan, defined tall buildings up to 18 stories. Those are consented and are constructed on the site.
Sorry, the approach in the previous plan was an allocation by allocation approach to allowing tall buildings.
Yes.
So it's a site specific.
It's a site-specific allocation. I think I've just tried to my memory, going back to that, the idea we had whether or not tall buildings were defined that way. I can't recall. But the principle of the fact we've got, well, this is, like I said, 2 building plots, so that possibly could account for at least another 300 to 400 homes, 300 homes on those 2 sites, but not defined currently as tall buildings.
So your one remedy in a mapping sense would be to extend the zoning designations to include built-up areas of tall buildings, thereby allowing the possibility of some infill or redevelopment of a slot within it that's there.
It is surrounded by tall building zones, but I know what happened. The council thought, you've seen the scheme, it's developed out, and probably removed it for that reason, but it's just a quirk of this approach means that it's a little bit of a black hole in how you deal with remaining development opportunities within what was a allocated site and existing tall buildings.
It does come back, I suppose, to this very precise mapping approach that's been done with these very specific areas, lines, and then even areas within them for the prevailing. Okay. Council.
Yes. A few points. Because we are talking about the areas.
The zones, lines.
And there are some objections to that, but I just want to clarify that we are in line with the plan, which is specifically requiring specifically requiring development to define tall building areas.
Locations, I think.
And locations. Put a boundary on a map, so it will be like a zone.
Well, unless it's not a boundary on a map, it's a more broadly designed zone.
But how would you do that? Like how, if you offer clarity about where you cannot, because this is the direction of, we need to define the space. The London plan is clear that, we are changing from, it's a different policy context from the we have been used to, where we were assessing site allocation in the case-by-case basis and see if it was in line with the context or if it would exceed the height. But what the London plan is asking with the policy 9 is to have a more strategic approach and move from this side-by-side reactive approach to a proactive approach where we are identifying areas where we want growth and where we think that is more suitable for this type of building form, which is something which will have a major impact on environment and visual impact. It's a different direction, and the London plan is requiring to define tall building areas and to define the height that we want in those building areas. So I think it's not asking to have a flexible approach in that sense. It's asking to define and be clear about where we want to go to be direct. So we are in line with that. And I want to pick up this later in terms of site specific.
No, I think we'll do that site specific later, but this broad principle, I suppose, of again, how we've come to, you can use the example of the brown line on the TVZ 16 in.
So I think we need to look at the field all wide. So there might be some errors or some areas that we draw more, probably not following exactly the boundary line of the site. So it can be a modification that we're happy to take away and look at if we want to align more that specific area to the site allocation boundary line. We're happy to do that because it might be just an error in drawing the line, like it was more like high level, so in that sense. And also like because the tall building strategy has been also tested in the site capacity. There was a desire in that area to also have an open space, so we can come back to that. But when we talk about the site, if we are more like indicative about where open space is, so we can increase the area of that tall building zone. And I think on the gas work side, I think, it's quite clear in the tall building paper why the reason why we have excluded the gas work.
I understand both sides. I think it's a matter we can come back to talking about the specifics of the policy and what side may or may not be suitable. Right. So the explanation for this brown line on TVZ 16 now then is that it was done at high level.
I mean, we are looking not on a side-by-side area, but it's more like broad. Of course, I know that we want to say that we have looked at site allocations. Yes, we have identified areas like drawing some areas of buildings, and we haven't really followed exactly the boundary line. And this, if you look at high level, that's part of what's more to develop something. Maybe when you go in detail, you can argue that actually to build more or something can be fit. If you look at high, it's a small area that has been cut out.
This is only one example of a brown line, which we're looking at. It obviously raises the question of all the others. You're saying that we're done at a broad level, but we don't have an explanation for each one how it was done, and how we say actually you want this to be much more specific, and you jump to the location boundary. May or may not be an approach, but we'll get to that. So I think let me just pause on it and I think to think about this. I mean, you say that the London plan, in principle, it's great. It's not the London plan spec. You're trying to accommodate grant. You're trying to be grand-led and steer it to the places. He's trying to be, give clarity to where the problem will be. All understood. It's the but the London plan doesn't require you to put lines on the map. It talks about defining locations, isn't it?
But
tall buildings.
On development plan,
Yeah, locations. That's different from sites, tall buildings. And this is, by putting a line on an OS map base, you're defining a site for a building in effect or a complex.
But
I'm not saying it's inconsistent.
Clear that we need to those locations in the development.
Yes. But you could define a location in a less line-specific way. How you were talking about your transformation areas earlier, not being a line on a map and it having a more blurred.
But if you are showing one area in half, being more specific.
Yeah, but it would still be. It would be on a diagram rather than a map. But that was the point. You didn't want to put them on the policies map for the very reason that I think is a reason why people are saying these lines on the map. And it's the combination of that specificity of the precise area and the specificity of policy in and outside that line that is combining to have this effect that may not be justified and effective. I think it's the issue.
I've got a context comment.
Okay, yeah.
Which is in relation to the overall strategy of the characterization study.
Yeah.
That was also when we started looking at capacities for each site. That also involved looking at what some sites were bringing forward, and in the case specifically of Valley Mills, we had no previous indication of what might come forward. So basically, our assessment for the site is based on our assumptions of what the capacity might look like, and I already mentioned that there are requirements, and it's not just the only site, it's a broader approach for green space and things like that. So where we've mapped where ideally we want these green spaces to be, that area obviously cannot be a tall building zone. So the tall building zones reflect our process and thinking around how we might optimize capacity for the site alongside what necessary infrastructure for those sites, and where they can't be in a tall building, it might be excluded partially. But obviously, things move on.
Yeah.
And we can still have a conversation and be flexible, as my colleague has mentioned already, about perhaps moving the boundary to reflect further steps we've made and further understanding now I have about each of the sites.
Yeah. You could have the green space within a tall building zone, couldn't you?
I think the problem we have is
in a design-led approach to development.
In a design-led approach. Yeah, so if you will look at site allocations, you will know that we tend to put a figure how much green space we want those sites to deliver. That is based on an understanding of the kind of green space we need, and that also will come around to the green space designation, which I can't talk fully about, but the idea is that there are constraints in terms of a park compared to something a bit more meaningful in terms of overall size and what that does for the community that impacts the design of the site. Yeah. And when you have a tall building zone, our experience is that with no kind of when you put something in a tall building zone, the tendency is to put loads of tall buildings all across the tall building zone in an effort to optimize site, but that it then creates these kind of tensions about how do you also make good spaces, microplanning, et cetera, We want to try and avoid it if possible, especially where we know that some of these spaces to be more substantial.
Okay, understood. I mean, as I say, I think the principle of what you're trying to do is all good. It's all planned ahead, and it's all trying to steer growth. But just before we do, I want to finish on this particular aspect of tall buildings, which is how the zones were identified and whether the specific boundary approach is justified and on its own. We talk about when we talk about policies, that, as I said, it's the accumulation of these things. So before we have a break, then, is anything else on my first part of the tall buildings, i.e., how the zones were identified and the approach?
James Strong.
Yeah.
I obviously won't later exactly discussing, but just to reflect on. First is that the lines on the plan, we agree with the sentiment with the lines on the plan from the so that's not what the plan requires. But it's the problem we're identifying is more specific here. The council themselves in their topic paper, paragraph 416, talk about their evidence, robustly evidences that tall buildings outside designated tall buildings would not be suitable for assessment. And so that's why we're interrogating that. And you can just test that. Imagine a Section 78 inspector applying that policy and then reading that in the evidence base and the council saying, well, we robustly tested. Where? We haven't seen it. this is our opportunity for that sort of communication on the people. So, well, you have been constructive. What we're hearing now is actually much more aligned with what we think should be the case, that the policy should be encouraging growth in zones. They are high level. That's not reflected in the lines of the plan or in what's been stated at the top. So that's our concern.
Yes, understood. Okay. Right. Anything else anybody wishes to say on this aspect of tall building? Yes, thanks for Green Market.
Could you just remind us what second?
Yes, I will do. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm going to move on to now is actually the wording of policy 4. So that will deal with whether the approach of not allowing tall buildings anywhere outside of these tall building zones is justified. And then come on to the aspects of policy D4, what it says about the height of buildings within tall building zones, maximum heights and prevailing heights. So it's 2 policies relating to within the zone in effect, maximum heights and prevailing heights, and then there's a policy for land outside the zones, which is no tall buildings. So we'll deal with that. And then, with some reluctance, go through any more site-specific issues that can't be dealt with under the site allocation days, because that's where there's a more focused group and we can get into more detail about the sites. But if there are specific things about zones and the height of zones that will have general significance, we will pick them up today. But I don't want to take too long on that. So, sorry, does that answer the question? Yeah, okay. Right, so thank you for that. It is 5:07. So can we resume at 25 past, please? Okay, it is 25 past, so can we resume, please? I'm about to move on to the wording of various parts of policy B4, but I noticed the council got the nameplates up, so.
I think it's just before going into the next point, just I want to clarify that in terms of boundary line, we consider that we are in line with the London plan, which is specifically asking to define zones, and this is also shown in the characterization and growth G. If you go at page 2, it shows how to define the height and the zone within some specific areas. So, if there was something that we can look at Abbey Mills, but in general, the approach is in conformity with the London plan, and it's sound and it's justified and well evidenced and robust evidence in the building annex. So just to clarify that about the boundaries.
Yeah, okay, hang on. Let me just make a note of the London plan guidance.
Yes.
It's they're listed here, aren't they?
Revitalization and growth strategy (LPG). It has a section where it explains how to identify areas for buildings, and then a page.
Hang on, I've said that because I've not actually got a document. Is it in the library for a start?
I don't think
I don't know. Tell you what. Send it to Charlotte. Okay. And it's the London plan guidance. What's the title of it?
Characterization and growth strategy (LPG).
Yeah. Okay. So that's got relevant to defining geographical areas.
We have based our methodology on guidance.
Okay, that's helpful. And going back to the London plan policy, tell me which specific part, because I thought the London plan policy was to define locations, designate locations, we're told of the appropriate.
So part B.
Which part?
Yeah. Part B is in LPP, say determine if there are location where tall buildings may be appropriate for development, subject to meeting other information plan, and then say 2 tall buildings should be identified on maps in development plans.
Yes. Okay. So that. Yeah. Okay.
And
it's not inconsistent with that, but it's not. It's not like you don't have to. Anyway.
The GLA was supportive of the methodology.
Yeah.
So we have indicated the topic.
I think I suspect I can hear you, but I suspect people at the back probably can't hear you. So could you try and speak up a bit louder? Okay. Well, let's move on. I'll read the LPG note. And I understand, and as I said before, I understand what I'm aiming to do. It's consistent with the London plan and justifying. But let me move on then to policy D4, which is it's got. And then it's got the long list of the zones with heights relating to those further guidance, and it's got some sort of design criteria, parts 3, 4, obviously for the detailed implementation. So we're focusing on now, the main thing I'm focused on now is the approach, first of all, outside the zones, and then the approach within the zones. So first of all, approach outside the zones is clear. So it's quite clarity and certainty. You've got a line on the map, and outside there, no tall buildings. Would you say that's consistent with policy D9 and then plan D3, which says tall buildings should only be developed in locations that are identified as suitable in development. So, in principle, yes. Okay. Understood. Right, comments on that? Anybody wishes to comment on that? Yeah, Polymar.
Yes, thank you. We mentioned this. This is inconsistent with D9 and understanding council's interpretation, but there was obviously passed through a decision, which is on a court case, which tests this exact point, whether or not tall buildings, by definition, falling outside the zone, fall foul of work B and therefore go no further. But the interpretation in that court case was that it's not a gateway, and that Part C of policy D9 still applies. Therefore, if a tall building is outside the tall building zone is applied, it's still entirely appropriate to be considered against Part C. And therefore, it could be acceptable if it does comply with all those parts of the policy. And the reason I raised the quirk previously is if you play out the example I gave you earlier on Lord Walk, where we are now no longer in a tall building zone, but have current schemes proposed which exceed the definition of tall building, we would technically, or should be, including that policy. Therefore, would be sitting here saying, well, we shouldn't be exceeding that height. It should not be acceptable in that location, despite the fact that there's already kind of permission for buildings up 18 stories in a matter of about 20 metres away from the site. We identified two remedies for that. One was to change, obviously, the geographical location to tall buildings. But I think there's a more fundamental point here, which is just that the approach to D9 is not a simple gateway. It's appropriate to identify the locations that sit there in the local plan, and that's entirely appropriate. But there may be and can be circumstances where Part C of D9 is engaged. And I just think the language which is used is slightly different from policy D9 as well. Noticeably different in policy D4, draft local plan, in terms of where it's only acceptable. So I understand that, but that was part of Master Group decision, which looks at this, and it's one which has been tested around London. So it is an issue where you can apply Part C of D9, or D9 London plan, to things which is outside. The terminology there is just too prescriptive.
I think the council has responded to that case, hasn't it, in its PP1, topic paper 1. And it acknowledges that, yes, that case relates to development management decisions based on London Plan 2021, but it doesn't directly relate to the preparation for local plans. And it doesn't say that local plans can't set a policy relating to development outside locations identified as suitable. I think that's the council's response.
That's fair enough. I don't disagree with that issue. I identify tall building zones.
Yeah.
And directing tall buildings to those zones. I mean, that is a well-structured framework for policy. I think it's the terminology that's used in several places within the actual wording of the P4, local plan and non-local plan, the notion that they will only be acceptable in those locations. Now, anyone reading it as a layperson will take that as a literal, you can only deliver tall buildings in those locations.
Yeah.
It will be directed to, tall buildings should be located. It's slightly different. It's a statement only acceptable in those locations. And I think that's it. And there is a second part to that as well, which is which I'm sure we're going to come on to, which is the second part of that sentence, which then says should not exceed the respective limits.
Yeah, I mean,
but to put together that says, firstly, you should put a tall building anywhere outside the tall building zone, and you should never exceed those limits. And you can also apply that to a tall building which was 21 plus meters outside the zone. So I think that's sort of very stringent. I'd say wording goes beyond the current plan approach. It could lead to strange circumstances, and
I understand. I don't want to get bogged down in that court case, but I read D9 part V3, which says tall buildings should only be developed in locations identified as suitable for development. It seems to be fairly clear to me. In those locations.
I think it's used to not say the word acceptable. It's a different interpretation. That applies to
no acceptable location outside of the buildings, whereas it should only be, but I accept that, and I think it's use of the word acceptable, which differs. I'm not going to get into embarrass the sort of semantics.
Yeah, okay, let's move
I
on.
would read that.
But anyway, that case,
Trust policy as a far more forceful approach for the London plan. Okay. And there has been a lot of confusion about London plan because that master court case would have occurred and it not being for a sort of decision to work out how you apply these sorts of policies.
yeah, it seemed clear to me, but oh, no, I'm not. Okay. AEIF.
Thank you, James Strong, AEIF. First of all, I should say for our particular interest in the boundary changes, and practically doesn't point doesn't matter.
No.
It matters in principle,
Yeah.
just in principle. I agree, or we agree with the representation just heard about the effect of the Master case. And the policy, the point about the Master case was the need to read the policy as a whole. Yeah, and whilst you're right, you initially, it looks clear when you read it in isolation, when you read it with the criteria for acceptability of the buildings, that's where the court stepped in and said, read the whole. You can, of course, have a building which is acceptable, though it's not been identified in a plan in one particular condition. But the second point I want to make about that is that insofar as you are going for a more restrictive policy approach, and this is back to the boundaries and the ceilings, you don't have to justify why it is you reach a conclusion that it's only in those locations that the building is acceptable. And that's the problem here, because whilst there is characterizations, I mean, to come back to that, some evidence based to say how they selected tall building zones, there isn't the analysis to support the principle that you can't have tall buildings outside of those locations. You won't find that analysis and come back to our particular site without, as an example, just why, how and why it's said outside absolutely you can't have it. So that's a sort of logical extension to the Master interpretation. The reason why London plan policy shouldn't be seen as the official reading I expect is because in order to exclude everywhere else, you have to do a lot of very detailed work, which hasn't happened here.
Yeah, understood. Okay, thank you. William.
Yeah, I'm quite happy with
Yeah.
the statements that you just heard, gateway policy. I think our feeling is that there's a weak policy, there's not some amendment made to set out how it's not a full building zone might be dealt with it, notwithstanding that it's a very restrictive approach. And Lewisham local plans are recently adopted local plan. An example of how they dealt with it is a paragraph in that local plan that explains that development proposals for building plans that depart from parameters set by the local plan will be considered having regard to relevant material considerations. In such circumstances, a wide public benefit should be demonstrated to justify the design of the development. That's one example, but it is something that says, okay, if we have something before us that's not in compliance with you said how.
It seems you referred to that. Can you send that to the program officer? Oh, is it? Okay, no, don't worry then. If it's something else, I apologise. Council.
Yes.
So just on this issue of outside, and then we'll come on to the policy inside. Yeah.
So in regard to the master plan case, I think you explained quite well that in the full text paper, I went through that case.
Yeah.
And we recognize that there is a master plan case and this set a precedence to approve scheme outside of building zone. It should happen in specific circumstances, it shouldn't be the baseline. And also it was interpretation of how to apply London plan policy 9 on the scheme that was approved prior to the London plan 2021, and it was assessed against local plan. They didn't have tall buildings, also it was referring to a different planning context. It wasn't referring to local plan that is required to have tall buildings. So yeah, it's true. There is the Master Board case. We acknowledge that, and we are also confident that by setting a spatial strategy and a hierarchy of height, we are already avoiding this to happen, because we have already gone through a thorough assessment of where buildings are more suitable, which buildings are more suitable. So these will actually be very specific exception circumstances. And in terms of why we are excluding some zone, is also based on the sensitivity assessment that is included in the tall building annex, which assess what are the areas that are considered sensitive and exclude those as to be suitable for tall buildings. These are mainly conservation areas, open space, areas with low etal. So there has been an assessment, there is a justification for excluding and considering those zones not for tall buildings. However, we also, when we did the assessment, we recognized that specific areas overlap with opportunity areas, so sensitive area straight overlap with opportunity area. In case we have taken forward this area as suitable.
But that sieving exercise, which I alluded to earlier and it's repeated, that was done before figure 34 was mapped, which identifies the suitable areas.
Yes. Yes.
So still back to this issue, if all those areas are suitable for tall buildings.
So it was two parallel. Two parallel exercise. One was understanding which are the areas that are sensitive to tall buildings, and in principle exclude them, and then see the areas that are suitable for tall buildings, and in principle consider this suitable for tall buildings. But then when you overlap the two maps, you will find some inconsistencies, or some areas that are, for example, within the airport constraint safeguarding zone. They are in opportunity area, so we can't really ignore that. What we did was to have, and then we can come back to this later, but basically by adopting a strategy with different height, we have used the lower parameter in those areas that are more constrained. So in airport, safeguarding zone includes the proximity areas.
Okay, well, leaving aside the Master Board case, I think that, well, unless someone maybe,
I might have another point on that, sorry, is that we disagree with the idea of adding word relating to the Master Board case, because this flexibility is already afforded by the policy referring to the Master Board case in the assessment of the areas, and being approved outside is already flexibility that they can have based on the Master Board case and on the development management, not on the plan making.
Okay, I understand the thing. But I don't think I have a principle. I don't have an objection in principle to a development policy in this plan, basically saying tall buildings should be within these areas and not outside them. If the areas are, the mapped areas are clearly justified. They've got specific boundaries, and specific boundaries are justified. As I said earlier, the problem I think we have is a bit of a gap between the level of specificity based on a relatively high level study with the specificity of, one side of the line and another. But in principle, as I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with providing that clarity. Otherwise, everything becomes a free-for-all again if it's too. I'm going to go through the rest of this, and then I'm going to have to think about, what, if there is a soundness issue, what the possible remedy might be in terms of lines on maps and/or policy wording. It's the combination of those things that's potentially, as a technical approach in broad terms, it's good, it's helpful. So anything else subject to that? Is anything anybody wants to say about outside small building zones? Otherwise, we'll move on to policies within them, which in essence comes down to two elements. So we're moving on, okay. Which is the maximum heights and the prevailing heights. Let's be clear about the words that we have related to those. So the words maximum heights and prevailing heights don't appear until we get to table 1. Do it. Okay. Part 2 of the policy says the height of tall buildings in the tall building code should be proportionate to their role within the local and wider context. So that's the design approach. Yeah, expressed words. And should not exceed the effective limits set out in table 1. So we come on to table 1. We have height limits expressed as height range maximum in one column, which is a value of 3, 32, 15, 12. Yeah, some categories. So you've got those maximums, and then you've got prevailing heights in the further guidance column. Yes. And those, because of the way part 2 is written, they are limits. The prevailing heights and limits as well. Is that the intention?
Heights. The intention is that. Can I go and explain the methodology? Or do you?
What's the answer? Are they limits? Yes and no.
Yes, they are.
They are limits, right? Okay, right. Okay, so that's understood. And that's the way it seems to be written.
Yes.
Because part 2 says they're limits, and then prevailing height should be between 9 and 21 or whatever. So that's fairly clear as well. So the combination of those things is. Yeah. I know the design approach. I think I understand what we're going through. Okay, so that's fine. So understood. That's the intention. So on the maximum heights, and then we'll come on to the prevailing heights. The maximum heights, the maximum heights permissible in each area seem to be based on the local centre hierarchy, the level of accessibility. So retail, but if you're 6, you're more likely to be that. And is it formulaic or is it a judgment? Combination of these things.
Judgment. Yeah.
So these are the local centre height.
Yeah.
Level of accessibility, prevailing height of the context. Yeah. And a judgment is made on those 30. Which is what you said before, yeah. Okay, understood. Yeah. Okay. So it provides clarity. You know what the criticisms are. First, let's take the London plan policy first of all. That refers to appropriate building heights. And it's deliberately expressed. It wasn't. They deliberately didn't choose that. And they say that a maximum height may be appropriate and justified in certain circumstances, whereby it's clearly justified by some very specific considerations, such as safety or a long distance view, which analysis to show that height would. So why this different approach to the more flexible approach in the
We consider we are not taking different outputs from the plan. We are in conformity with the London plan because at supporting text 3.2 states in the location determine the maximum height that could be accepted. And these approaches that are maximum also regulate in the transition into LPG, which in paragraph 4.412 suggests that define the appropriate height for each building and to express them as a maximum to offer more clarity at planning application stage. So basically, because we have following the methodology characterization of local PG, we decided to have maximum height with this. The GA suggests to have at later stages, not during the first round of consultation, because the regulatory team supported approach. Regulatory team, they suggest to have appropriate height rather than maximum height parameter, and yeah, I've explained it in the building topic. But what the GLA was suggesting was that giving appropriate height will give more flexibility where and how to distribute the height within the zone. But we didn't make that change at the point because we consider that the way the policy is set up for this different heights from 32 to 100 meters, we have already responded to this aspect and related to the context already and taking consideration already of airport constraint and proximity to conservation area. So we consider that it was sound in the maximum height because we have already established a hierarchy that the GLA would like to achieve through more flexible wording.
Through a climate-led approach. So it comes back to the degree of the fine-grained nature of the characterization study and whether. So yes, I'm reading 3.9.2. It's a kind of explained apparent anomaly between a breeding rights, and it does say, doesn't it, 3.9.2, in these locations determine the maximum acceptable. So the policy should express it. Suppose you this process, you determine a maximum height, and then you have a policy that uses that as an appropriate height. Okay, so the town.
Chris Gaskell, United. You touched on it earlier, so which is the relationship between the evidence base and planning commissions that already exist. Is that an appropriate point to talk about that, or would you like to talk about it?
No, mention it now, it's okay, because it relates to the maximum height.
Yes, it relates to the evidence base. And I will, I'm not going to drift into site-specific, but I will use Thames West as an example.
Yeah, okay.
Point, if that's okay. So this tomorrow. So I think the key point from our perspective is it appears anyway that the talking evidence base isn't overly underpinned anyway by planning commissions that already exist. And in our case, we have a planning commission for 5,000 homes, which is implemented and thankfully going to be built out during the plan. So it's very significant towards the housing trajectory and land supply. But again, in our case, planning commissions approved for buildings up to 98 metres. Okay, we have 20 buildings, of which 19 of them significantly exceed the 50-metre cap that has been put onto this particular site location. Yeah. So I suppose our point and our concern, I think, is across the site location is that relationship between housing land supply and trajectory, which is a good thing, versus evidence base for site allocations, which is in the absence of a detailed understanding of the payoff that exists. So I suppose our concern being, which already what's the problem here, is for developments of such as Thames West, 5,000 homes built out over 10 years, perhaps more, other economic cycles, and also as the guidance check, like you could call it safety as a prime example of that. Newham is kind of very good reasons, but it's necessitating many planning commissions needing to be revisited, amended, etc. Point being that they need to engage essentially in the planning system again at some point during the gestation of a plan period. Yeah. And you have a planning commission in our case for many buildings up to 98 metres. You then need to go back through the process of engaging with planning and development management. And all of a sudden, because of the wording here, you find yourself exceeding the height limits and therefore all of a sudden contrary to the local plan. Now, of course, the development policies allow you to have that dialogue, the existing consent is with your consideration, but it feels that we're setting ourselves up by kind of ignoring these existing planning commissions to basically make it harder than it needs to be.
Understood. Looking at it from, I think, what the council's response would be, maybe to clarify, is that those planning permissions may have been granted at the time before the characterisation study, and the plan-led approach they now want to take in terms of strategic approach to locations where building etc. and therefore it wouldn't be right to just reflect all the planning permissions that exist. But so that's the other extreme, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which where therefore they not taking account of them, I think. But maybe somewhere in between. Yeah.
And that's good. Again, we can talk about this tomorrow in more detail, but in our case, the proposal is for a 50-metre cap and permission granted, obviously, itself has been subject to very extensive scrutiny in townscape, meaning that basically the entire development would be contributed very significantly, contrary to the local plan, to the extent that 5,000 homes, a very important part of the council's housing plan supply, would in theory come to the development plan. So I suppose our request to talk about tomorrow is a recognition of, maybe it's not a planning permission, but one's quite unique case which have been granted, have been implemented, but are not yet on site and therefore contribute to your test. Ways in which those can marry up. You take the point, sir.
And of course, that development, when it's completed, will change the character of the area. And the analysis that you then do for where a tall building zone should be, may be different, can reach a different conclusion. Unite.
Good morning, sir. My name's Matthew Rowe from our planning. We've heard that the councils are very set limits on development. And that's what we're concerned about. The general conformity with the framework, optimise housing supply. We have not explained before, but we're not concerned about 129 and 130. And there it talks about existing shortage of land for housing. In that context, I'm not aware that the government saying there was 2040 it started in London in the first quarter, first half of the year. In Newham, there's only 10 new build houses started. Clearly going to be a major housing crisis going forward. And in that context, the plan talks about optimising land and using minimum density, for example, in city and centres, locations like Wellsale, like public transport. I've heard the plan has yet reference to minimum density. What this limit is effectively setting maximum density completely abolished with the framework. It's odds with the London plan. As the GLA, they state based on their expectation, they read out. They said the maximum standards going to apply to the airport safeguarding areas and the protected view, which is protected by different legislation and not applied under this policy. We've got two working examples of this. My Jubilee House, which admittedly has been constructed. That's 120 metres back out of the actual playing station, 100 metres. And really essential to solve the gateway process. A very sustainable location is a consent scheme that stands at limit of 135 metres. So it's got difficulty to get the gateway under the policy forward restricted to a limit of 100 metres, which is nonsensical. So in that context, we believe the policy is not justified. Will be effective in meeting the housing needs and is consistent with the national and policy.
Okay, thank you. Understood. EIM.
Thank you, James from AEIM. I just want to be any further. I agree, but just going back to that 3D spatial strategy, this is intended. Script, and that just reinforces now thinking vertically rather than zones. It reinforces the need for the element space to justify a ceiling in the data script. And you respect me saying that that is the way one should approach the London plan policy. In fact, the policy itself, policy versus the supporting text, talks about the progress. So if there is a tension between the two together, it's the policy, policy rather than commentary text. So agree there is a tension between the same policy. Secondly, although the GLA are here, you do have the representative on this environment, which is taking account of the evidence-based approach maximum. And that, these days, is quite consistent. Having looked at the evidence base, is there a proper justification for efficacy, a proper type of need? Absolutely, so no. And I hope that just to give you a couple of other references, I think in 2022 characterization study, you can see that because, for example, our site capacity is based on it must be updated. The 2022 characterization study precedes the Mayor's 2023 guidance on characterization. So it was done before the Mayor's set out other principles of what was buildings. That characterization study plans that you referred to a moment ago itself identifies that paragraph 4.12 copy of that understanding, where limited evidence on the maximum building height has been gathered, boroughs will choose to define appropriate rather than maximum. And of course, we say GLA is clearly entitled to conclude that there's limited evidence. The other point about the permissions, we strongly, we put this in that we do not understand the current approach, which is aiming to take into account permissions which have been substantially started. Sure what the difference between start and substantial start, who judges that? That seems to us to be very strange. So, of course, there's an opportunity for judgment to be reached on specific permissions by local planning authorities to whether or not they're going to come forward. But that's not how this plan has been approached. It's just a blanket exclusion of permissions if they haven't been substantially started, regardless of whether or not they are reflecting aspirations of the council or not. And there is no justification for that if you're seeking to characterize for the future, because of plans for the future, the character has already consented. And just one other reference we go forward for our side. Policy D9 of the London specifically identifies in paragraph 3.9.3 that in areas of extensive change, such as opportunity areas, go back to the fact we're in an Olympic opportunity area, but other areas, the threshold for what constitutes a tool should be evolving, not just the existing context. And of course, therefore, excluding beyond consideration missions who are already granted when they're not yet have started, is actually setting your face for taking into account the logic to it. And I know I'm trying to avoid site specifics. You can't get a better example than last because you'll see very substantial cliffage of tall buildings, either consented since the characterization or reserve access for original decisions. And yet we've now planned for the future on sites like that, are adjacent, stuff like that, planning for the future as if they don't exist. And that cannot be found.
Understood. Okay. Similarly.
Thank you. A few points. I agree with all the statements that we have just heard. We to share the position of the GLA, which is that the policy before is inconsistent with we spoke yesterday in the analysis session around the cumulative impact of policy asks or requirements, and I think that this is one of them. For reasons we've just heard, setting max heights unfairly constrains development and is inconsistent with the framework and it doesn't incorporate sufficient flexibility for short buildings to follow a design-led approach. We can get into the specific heights that are site allocation experience, but I think they have demonstrated lack of robustness in the children space. And it's, of course, it's not fair to expect the council to carry out a detailed design exercise for every single site in the borough. That's not the role of the local plan. But it is the role of the local plan to have sufficient flexibility to allow that to be determined in the decision plan at the application stage, and as drafted, a local policy team does that.
Okay, thank you. I'll just go to LDDC and then I'll come back.
Thank you. Three quick points, if I may. First of all, can I sort of endorse the comments made at the exam permissions point? We have in particular one exam permission where there is a cap limit of 50 metres, but it has a permission for a 92 metre tower. We have gone through an extensive procurement process to procure a developer on that basis, and it would seem, and also through the planning commission, an extensive design review to ensure that building was designed to the highest quality to justify that size. So again, I feel that the policy to sort of pull that down is not justified. The second comment on another one of our sites is that there seems to be a lack of relationship between the building heights that are set out and the site capacity set out. Maybe this is but we have one particular site where the site allocation has an aspiration of 680 units on there. The extant permission for that is in conformity with those parameters, with those limits, sorry, but only delivers about 575. So we've been working actually with new officers to enhance the heights in certain sites areas so we get much closer to that without surpassing that target on that site. And the third element, the third point I'd just like to quickly make, is that there's also on some sites, so one particular site, the LLDC, there is we have a site which we think massively underestimates the site capacity. Therefore, if the heights are being informed by what that site capacity is, and we think the site capacity assessment is flawed, then I think the height assessment for that site needs to be considered as part of a much wider reconsideration. I think that is something in more detail in that support actually was raised as a
Yeah, okay. We've got the detail. Just where we say where we think there's an inconsistency between the tall building heights and the capacity assessment. Capacity assessment. The ED3, I think it is. I thought they took the tall building heights and used those as one of the key criteria for working out the capacity.
Well, the external consent for that site case is 50 metres, which is the limit. We could not get to 680 units with those capped heights. So we've had to go significantly higher on a small number of targeted areas of the perimeter of the site, so we can ensure sort of design in the central development to make sure we get closer to that capacity. So that's 700.
So you're saying that the characterisations that we lead into the capacity, it was too simplistic to assume you can get that capacity with that height.
There's some mismatch there.
Yeah, okay. Right, Ballymore.
Just probably building on this, we obviously heard that the housing need when following housing approach or following capacity approach. And one of the students has one of the limitations on that capacity was the study that fed into the moment here. The question whether or not we said yesterday that with traditional housing under the special measures of housing, etc., whether there should be a more aspirational approach into capacity to better reflect even this is one of those policies that probably jars against that. And if we are to read this policy as written, it is quite prescriptive. It does say that it should not, the built order should not exist from the perspective set out on table 1. I think that it's not just necessarily maximum, it's also prevailing height.
Can I come on to the prevailing as well? But yes.
So I think we read that as a very prescriptive thing. You've raised it already, so that this is consistent with policy the 900 plan. And again, just to emphasise paragraph 3.9.2, where it does refer to 0.2, it's still ready, but it says the determine the maximum height that could be acceptable. And I think that is a different approach framework to that which we're seeing in policy. So I think that is this capacity is inconsistent with plan. We have some concerns over the open space character study, but we'll come on to that in the individual.
Okay. So tell me that 3.9.2. Tell me why the reference to the maximum height. So this is reason justification, not policy. So that's the first point. It's just an inconsistency. Well, this is trying to explain how to go around about identifying appropriate heights. You could really, so in trying to identify the appropriate height, what 9 tells you to do, you go through these steps, and then there's further LPG guidance. So one of them is that part of the process is to identify the maximum heights that could be appropriate, which I think is why I said it. That doesn't then say, well, then express the policy over maximum heights. Is that important?
Exactly that. Yeah. And just again, it's the wording.
Okay, thank you. Right. On maximum heights again.
Yeah. I won't repeat that
No.
we think that we are in line with the London plan and follow that guidance, the LPG guidance. However, I want to just clarify again the approach that we have established, a two-stream approach where we are defining the height based not just on the we are balancing the housing needs with also the necessity of respect the character of the context in each area of the borough. So that's why we have different height parameter, because each of these heights will help us to basically meet with the context. And this is also well evidenced and explained again in the full build topic paper, TP1. At page 40, you will see the table that you can see the table 3, the existing height that we have identified in the context and the proposed height, and these are aligned. Basically, they align with the prevailing height of the area and what are the tallest elements that we have identified in the area. Then if I can go back to the methodology, when identifying character, we have assessed what the height is in the context, and we have taken into consideration the planning application. We have basically we have mapped the existing height, the height of any emerging context that is substantially started, because this is we can rely on as a assessment of the character. We were aware of what the application pipeline, and if it was aligned with our spatial strategy, we are broadly aligned with those parameters that have been approved in the planning application. But we haven't included the has not been built. But because it has been raised, it means the representation don't align with the parameter they have approved broadly aligned. And it's just that meanwhile more reserve matter application, section 73, have been put forward to change those parameters. So it's a matter of like, when we stop this analysis, do we take in account what is built, what is approved, what is going to be built in the future, it's going to be amended, what has been approved. So it's very fluid.
Okay. Can I just ask you a specific question about that? Why? So if you've got a planning permission, it's not been implemented, they can see, well, okay, you could say we can draw the line there, that's a clear. You could say, well, that's not really realistic because most permissions are open. But anyway, but what does substantially started mean? If it started, kind of assume it's going to finish, and therefore the direction of the area is going to be changed by that development. So what's substantially started?
Substantially started means that is construction, so it's like actually building it.
How far? Once it's implemented, why can't you assume it's going to be finished?
Because, based on the monitoring that have been doing every year, we know that there are many sites that have been approved years ago and they have not implemented, or they are about to expire. So we can't really rely on those parameters to define what Newham is now. And then if I can also make another point in response to the night representation, is that yes, we are putting a cap of maximum height, but this doesn't mean maximum density. So just to clarify that density is not exactly height, like we don't go really in parallel, like one is not effect of another. And this is explained very well also in the LPG when it talks about optimizing site capacity, it talks about optimizing site through medium-price buildings, and how you can achieve actually better density sometimes if you choose a different building form. And this is also included in the tall building paper. I think it's figure 12. Yes, figure 12, page 57. This is an extract of the LPG where you can actually see that the same scheme has been developed, like designed with tall buildings and was refused, and then it has been designed again with lower buildings achieving higher density. So this is really important. I will come back to this when we talk about the prevailing heights as well.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, so I understand it's not as simple as saying a maximum height is a maximum density.
Yeah, you're not putting a cap on density.
No.
You know,
But there is an interrelationship.
it can be.
But there are examples of it. Yeah, sure. AEIM.
Hi, I'm Lauren, AEIM. Just to pick up just as discussed, what you were saying, the townscape that approach is taken. I think effective that testing that's been carried out within the area space. There's no detailed testing to understand impact on townscape character. There's no views that we've seen through suggest that's happened. And yeah, there's sort of not that different testing of options. It is encouraged by the Plan D3 to arrive at optimised sites or / zones. And I think had sort of the townscape approach testing been carried out in the human condition, that would show sort of under optimisation of sites when to consider it in the community context, and how that's carried into the high policy.
Thank you. Sorry, I went over there. I don't know. Have you finished on the maximum height points that you wish to cover?
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, just to respond, I think we have taken a proportionate approach as standards.
No.
But overall, we have considered, we have taken a proportionate approach to understanding the context, and based on different analyses that are in the Newham characterization study, and considering heritage access and being very sensitive in close proximity to this area along lower parameters. But what the policy says is that these are tall building areas where you put up to this height. But maybe when you do the townscape assessment, you realize that you can it's more suitable to go lower. So having the height, it doesn't mean that you have to achieve that. You can go lower.
No.
If, you know,
Clearly.
when you
But doesn't, you know what I'm going to say that? Doesn't it say, yeah. Yeah, okay. Shall we move on to the prevailing heights then? That's another element of the policy. Again, these, as I said at the beginning, it is deliberate that these are limits, a phrase used in Part 2 before. So, it's in the topic paper quite clearly, your examples of where the approach to be taken, which is about a tall building on part of the tall building zone in some cases, not so, but then the blocks that are within these prevailing heights in other parts. Sometimes they're spatially specific due to the design analysis and things like that. So that's a deliberate approach to not just have tall building zone with all the buildings up to the maximum. It's more, I suppose the question then is, again, it's as an approach, it's understandable. But again, it's been prescriptive about what those prevailing heights are within the site and parts of the site.
Yeah, I think as I said before, all these prevailing heights and maximum heights are aligning and really drawn from the analysis of the context. So when we analyze the prevailing height of the context, we align the prevailing height of the new zone, the tall buildings or with those. And when there were tallest elements, we aligned the maximum height with the tallest element. But not the prevailing height as like complementing the maximum height with prevailing height has allowed us to have larger tall building areas where basically we can be more flexible about where we can locate the two. But what is important for us is the transition, because figure 3 of the tall building annex showed that Newham is like very low rise in price context. So for us, it's very important to achieve this transition and be sensitive to go from the tallest cluster to the very low rise building. And having this prevailing height, which in architectural and urban design terms is the shoulder building, it helps us to do that and be also more flexible about having larger area instead of being very specific about the point where you can have a full building.
Okay, thank you. So I don't see if there's any more questions on the prevailing heights. Yeah, no, it's understood. So other people, any comments on the approach in general to setting these prevailing heights, but also the fact that they're limits again?
Emma Lawrence, AEIM. I suppose the point of prevailing heights is sort of, it's not defined what proportion of the site comes forward under prevailing height and what forward under the high points of height of 20 meters. So that's potentially a different to be worked out at the application stage. But I think the second point on that is
Sorry, just to pick up on the second, the prevailing height issue is the same that we have talked about the maximum height in terms of the element space. There isn't a townscape approach to define the prevailing heights that we're aware of in order to set them in a way. And it's, the response to that was what we adopted a proportionate approach. Fine. A proportionate approach, what that means is we haven't done that work. That should be reflected in the policy that doesn't purport to be restrictive, as if we have done some more than a approach. That's the tension. Yeah, because they're setting the limits as if they've done the townscape work which they haven't. And the other thing, this will probably apply to a lot of sites. I don't know about the site specific, but when you set a prevailing height on a site that's the tall building zone next door to a pre-existing building zone, you're setting a prevailing height which has no context for the next door site. I can give you examples. UB16, we've got 36-story buildings, a few meters away from a prevailing height that is 9 to 12 stories. If anything's going to cause a townscape lack of transition, it's that level of restriction on the policy. So, fine, have a proportionate approach, but have a proportionate policy. Or it's good for both, but let's see the evidence that it can't accommodate via tall buildings. So it's in between the problem.
Yes, and yeah, as I said, the issue we need to think about is the restriction of the zone boundary and the height. Okay. That's it.
Sorry, Justin Penworthy, stands out 15%. Comments I'm about to make will focus on the site allocation, but of course, the site allocation requires some dictated approach. And I just wanted to point out that we believe it's a missed opportunity on client side, but in particular in this location, which is the bingo site, which is site allocation. The height is 14 stories. But the site itself is an opportunity area. It's also next to Stratford High Street DLR station, detailing 6B. And it seems like there's an opportunity for tall building in this location, particularly when you can see 32 stories directly opposite on the opposite side of the road, 21 stories behind the site, and basically an area, yes, there was a prevailing height in the wide sense, but directly adjacent to this site. It seems like there's an opportunity for a cluster of tall buildings in this particular site.
Well, let's deal with it on the site I mentioned. But just to be clear, I forgot, is the tall buildings ever? It's the height of the tall buildings ever. Well, it's the same thing. It's the maximum height.
Yes, it could be.
Yeah. Going on.
I suspect you're going to hear lots of particular comments.
Well, yeah.
That probably links to the hard semantic. I had really prevailing heights points, which I do think is concerning. Again, is whether or not that could be better dealt with as a design, because some of the issues I think council were raising to do with ensuring that not everything goes up to the maximum, variation in townscape, heights, etc., etc. I mean, that if it's a proper design-led response to the site, then that's encouraged. Surely that can be dealt with under design rather than necessarily setting caps within caps, or criteria being criteria.
But if it wasn't a limit, if it wasn't a maximum, very high.
We've had, I'm more at this point really relates more to the all the points very maximum I think still stand, but I think you've got this prevailing height sitting in the underneath. They are both applied as criteria caps for set of planning application. I think we understand why policy D9 does say the maximum, so there should be some identification of it's an appropriate building, it's a building. So then we have a prevailing heights underneath that. I think we understand is asking the council to express what might be considered maximum. You don't put a prevailing in there. The issue behind that seems to be variation to avoid a maxing out to the top, but surely not only is it probably a warranty to have a prevailing height cap or suggestion, but is it better dealt with in led design policy, which is asking you to review that as part of the response?
Well, let me ask the question again more clearly. If the prevailing heights were referred to, they weren't referred to as a limit, would that overcome that objection?
I think it would. Yeah, okay, it would. I think the concern was it's prevailing height on certain sites, but I think that is just to be clear, that is not a descriptive approach, because I think that.
But then, in terms of the design, I mean, this is a design policy, and it has parts 3, 4, and 5, and it refers to the London Plan Design for the Growth. So it's the design.
It does, but it also has, again, a comment in the message here, but it should not exceed the respect.
Yeah. So it's the limit. It's the cap.
It's the limit. No, we can probably make it. I think it just there was a concern about how this is going through.
Prevailing heights.
Not prevailing heights. It's what I think just first-hand experience of doing. They are applying the limits as limits. Even though they're draft site allocations, they have. It's just what we're making it.
Yeah. Well, I think if this plan provides clarity, so that's what I would expect if it was adopted in that form. So I don't think that's a bad thing if this is justified. I think it demonstrates it's a clear approach. Question of whether it's
just I think the point I was going to come on to is more about using the word appropriate.
Okay. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I don't know, just if it can be, I know that, it's within the table as set as a limit, but in the wording of the railing height, they should be. So it's a must. So it has already kind of flexibility.
Well, okay. I don't think there's much flexibility when it says should not exceed the respective limits. But if you're saying that's the intention, is that it's not a limit.
Yeah,
is that the intention?
It should be.
So is the intention that the prevailing heights are not
They are in the further guidance. We are seeing them as more suitable to have this transition, but we are imagining that they can be some implementation. We are not expecting that, if we are saying 21 meters, that will be 50.
Okay, right. So, I don't think, I know what you're saying about it, and it's a kind of, I mean, one of the questions I asked at the beginning is, are these boxes within the policies, boxes, or are they policy themselves?
I didn't explain.
Properly. And they are, so it's part of the policy. The policy part 2 says, should not exceed the limits. It doesn't say should not exceed the height range maximums. It's just that, so I think I would interpret it being that the limits that apply to the railing heights as well. But if you say that's the intention, that helps to some degree. Okay, thank you. Right. Anything else you want to say? No. So I've been through the key points, and I did say that when people have the opportunity to refer to some specific tall building zones and the heights within them and how they relate to planning permissions and site allocations, etc. And we are going to go through all of the site allocations and get a chance to come back and talk about it from that side today. But is there anything else that people wish to comment on, I suppose, of general applicability to the issue that we've been through that we haven't said in relation to a particular zone that's been adequately dealt with by the examples we have looked at or might be dealt with? No. Okay. No, yes, because it's Queen's Market. Okay.
This LPG, which is called optimizing site capacity.
Thank you. I think that's the one that.
There's 2.
This is another one. Yeah, we have.
There's one called the characterization and growth strategy. That's the one someone referred to.
Yes.
And then there's one which is I referred to too, which is when I said that that relies very much on asking people, and they're part of the stages involved in sieving, deciding this thing. That's what I was referring to. Then there's this other one called optimizing site capacity, which is more about individual sites, and it goes into types of building, and it is connected to the policy D.
In the plan, yes, because that's the top building policy. Yeah, okay.
It says, I was just picking up on what you said about meeting identified needs for housing. It does say that taller buildings do not, in page 44, it does say that taller buildings do not always result in more affordable homes. Additional height can increase development costs. This can be more evident in lower value. I don't know, I'm not an expert on them, but I just wonder if there's anything that needs to be said about an alternative form. Is that anywhere in the plan? Because it does seem weird that whole growth seems to be relying on tall buildings. I don't really understand that in terms of other things that could be achieved.
Okay. Well, I think that I'll let I think that the answer is that yes. I mean, we talked about the enhanced areas, didn't we? Which are most of the brother, that being moderate uplift in density, incremental range. So yes, I mean, it is aimed to facilitate development across the whole borough in appropriate locations. It's not just on the tall buildings.
But it's just the fact that they don't necessarily help affordable housing.
Well, we'll deal with the affordable housing policy when we move to it. I take the point that these are.
I was surprised to read that in this document.
It doesn't say
criticising this building form.
Before you, any last comment?
Yeah, just
A few last comments.
Just in terms of general points on policy, this links to TBZ 16, but it carries through into other building zone policies as well. In TVZ16, throughout the table is the requirement to conserve and enhance the character of heritage assets. That's conserve and enhances the stringent than statutory test. And the MPPF is also out of separate balancing provisions of the London Plan policy D9C, which says that those should take account of other than heritage assets and their settings. Within TVZ16, but again referenced in other TVZs, is the need to consider landmarks and key views. Those have been defined within the policy or within the heritage space, so that part of the policy can't be implemented or applied. And again, within TVZ16, in other TVZs as well, within the table, is a requirement to avoid overshadowing impacts on water courses. We suggest that that's too stringent and prejudice development. Just to use our site as an example, where it's nature tall buildings, in terms of the form of development, we introduce shadows at certain times of the day, and so there's a cumulative context, the slight tall buildings behind us, so we already have that.
In terms of the conserve and enhance, would that be rectified by conserve or enhance with the legislation, and then deal with all the other policies that we deal with heritage assets in the NDPF, in this plan, and in the London Plan, all saying slightly different things with the legislation, so as we always are in a very complicated decision-making process with heritage assets. So that would be that one. Okay. In terms of landmarks and key views,
yeah.
What's the council's comments on that? I mean, it's not strict as it says, they're not prescribed. It takes account, I mean, if there are, to this explain what it is.
I mean, all these further guidelines are the result of our presentation and reflect also the representation of the team. So most of the wording that is in the table has been really agreed. Sorry. Has already been, most of the wording in the table has already been agreed with historic and other public bodies. So it wasn't just something that we made up. It's based on analysis. It's based on presentation that we had from the legal, the historic grants. So all the wording and avoid the impact on water space, avoid the impact on historic assets, and it was made very specific by historic England that it shouldn't be like limit that avoids the impact on the heritage asset. And in the case of Abbey Mills site, it was proximate to a conservation area, so that's why it has this further guidance in the table.
Okay. Well, the heritage asset one, I think it does need changing to conserve or enhance to reflect the legislation. I think that to avoid overshadowing impact, well, as there will be some overshadowing, won't there? When you put a tall building up, it's going to cast a shadow, and it's likely to sometimes cast a shadow on a watercourse. So it's the extent of the impact becomes the critical thing. This is suggesting, not suggesting no overshadowing, it's suggesting no overshadowing impact. I'm not sure that's
the wording that we have is that we are suggesting to start from the water courses to avoid this overshadowing.
We avoid it or minimize it?
Likely avoid it, but if it is impossible to minimize because of the biodiversity that has been raised.
Yeah, I can understand the end. It just says, okay, okay. And in terms of the landmark and key views, is it clear what those are?
So we don't have key protected views within the board. Also, we have reference in the tall buildings and site allocation all the organization of the conservation and operation management plan. So we are referring to those key views that are in this document.
So they are defined in what did you say, in a conservation area?
Conservation area appraisal management plan, yeah.
So I think when any policy is requiring regard to be had to such a document, not part of the development, it generally needs to be expressed in a way where you have regard to that document as a matter of principle, because I'm not examining that document. Those landmarks and key views haven't been examined or necessarily. So again, it's the detailed wording, I think. So I think, again, all three of these points may need some just tweaking to ensure that they are justified in the national policy. So unless there's anything you further want to say, you can.
No, we suggested something.
Right, okay, well, thank you. So the council will do. So I've noted that. So there may be, I don't, again, there's nothing fundamentally wrong, it's just detail. I mean, I take the point that you've gone to the trouble of talking to Trinity and everywhere else. But, yes, fine, they may have a view of how it should be expressed, but it isn't necessarily, they are not definitive. I suppose that's what I've got to do. Right. Okay, thank you. Because I don't think I am revisiting B4 at another time. So thank you for that. Shows the extent of all these long policies in this plan, how many detailed points we may have as we plough through them all. Right. So I don't think I've got anything else to ask. Has anyone else got anything to say on policy B4 on this approach generally? And I think there are some things I need to think about. I think there will be further discussion about the heights and the zones when we talk about the allocations. So we may learn a little more about how these things work as we work through all those. So it may be one of those issues where, I'm not going to sort of come to any conclusion until we've been through further along the process, because okay, well, thank you all for the contributions this morning. Some of us are back this afternoon at 2:00 for the introductory discussion about matter 4, which is essentially about the capacity and trajectories in principle, not the detail of them. Sort of questions like that. And then we're going to move on to one particular neighbourhood, N17, which is of interest to one person here. Probably maybe of interest, but I don't think it's necessarily. So, okay, thank you all very much for contributing this morning, and we'll see some of you.